So let's see. Angry Dragon. Let's go for d4. And after d5, we're just going to go for c4. And we're going to play some classical chess. Now, in these positions, actually, you can do something funky, which is you can play e4 because black hasn't controlled this square. And after knight takes e4, black plays this move. And I actually never play this, to be honest, because I play some knight f3 systems. But I know that the theory goes bishop d2, then they'll take this free pawn, then you take here, then they'll take here on e4. Then I think you go knight e2. And it's a total mess. But last I checked, it was quite equalish. But I know Magnus Carlsen, he chose this move knight c3. And of course, if you don't know quite what you're doing, then you had better play something a little bit less sharp and crazy than this line. So I'm going for instead for this hopefully calmer version where the point is that whether he takes like this, takes and then takes here, or whether he goes takes first, which makes the most sense. In this structure here, I actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if a3 was the move or knight f3 was the move. Maybe it was knight f3 was actually the Magnus move. But in any case, my idea with this position is that my structure is clearly worse than my opponent's. But on the other hand, I have the bishop pair. So I'm hoping that all in all, this is kind of, it balances itself out. I want to play the move bishop e3, but I'm a little bit concerned about the response knight g4. So that's what I'm thinking about right now, whether to play a move like h3. Just to cover, the thing that makes me a bit reluctant about this is it's a little bit slow. I would prefer not to have to invest the tempo in it, but I do want my bishop on e3 because I want the d4 square, which is already coming under, the d4 pawn, which is already coming under fire. I want it to be a little bit better protected than it is right now. So my intention is bishop to e3, and then I'll go about developing my bishop, and then I'll castle. If I can get away with everything like this, I should be better because I have a center, I have a better center, and I have the bishop pair on it, the type of board where the bishop pair can be quite useful. And I think that overall that should count for more than his main advantage, which is the better structure. That's my feeling. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my feeling. If I can actually get what I want in this position. In other words, if I can, complete my development. But that's actually quite a big if, because the other thing that he has in his favor, if we look at chess, like in terms of the differences in your opponent's position versus yours, this word of imbalances. So the imbalances in his favor are the structure, number one, but also the lead in development. Notice that if he wants, he can castle immediately. Whereas for me, because I've played this pawn move and then I had to capture and then I played this pawn move, and of course I built up this bigger center, all of these moves have taken time. And that's why, even though I have the white pieces, I'm the one lagging behind. So he goes for castle. And now, in this case, I'm thinking that I will put the bishop on d3. And it looks as though I've blundered a pawn here. After pawn takes, knight takes, knight takes. He can go queen takes d4 here. But the point here is that I will have the move bishop takes h7, which would pick up the queen. So that's a little bit of a tactic, cheeky tactic. I don't think he's going to fall for it. He's a near 2100 player, so a competent player. I think if it was a beginner, then I would be very enthusiastic about the prospect of winning the piece, but winning the queen, but I don't think so. So my opponent is thinking quite a bit, which makes sense. I think the stakes are quite high in this position because, as I say, long term with the bishop pair and with the central pawn mass, these are things where if I can consolidate, if I can solve the problems of my position, which is the development lag, which I'm very close to solving, and the worst structure, which is a harder problem to solve. It's a more long-term problem. But if I can solve those problems while keeping my assets, namely the bishop pair, then then he's going to potentially be in a bunch of trouble long term. So I think he needs to think about, and I think that's what he's doing. He's thinking about what's the best way to put White's position under pressure. He should play with the initiative because of the fact that he had a little bit of a development lead. Okay, so he goes queen a5. That's a really nice square for the queen because it's very hard to attack it. And from there, she's defending the pawn on c5 and also pressing against these potential weaknesses. One thing about it, though, is it does shift the queen from a central role, from where she was able to look at the queen side, the king side, and the center, and now is not able to actually look at the center, so at the king side. So one thing that's interesting there is I have these two pieces, and maybe instead of, like, one direction that I could take in this position is, rather than go for, let's say, a defensive move, or even something like this, just with the focus on defending, instead I could go something like bishop g5 and say, well, if you do take this pawn, then maybe I'm going to have some kind of trick. Like, maybe I can get rid of your final defender, and then I can use my pieces to somehow target your king. I'm not seeing anything concrete, so I'm not going to go for that. Instead, the move I'm leaning towards playing is queen c2, defending the pawn, but also increasing the amount of pressure I have against the king side. But what I don't love so much about queen c2 is that after h6, I'm not sure exactly how I should proceed. Maybe, I guess, just some normal move with bishop e3 or something like that. So that seems reasonable. I'll go queen c2. One thing that I missed here, one important idea, is that he might actually play e5 here, which would make a lot of sense with the rook here on e8. On the other hand, and also not just is e5 not just desirable from that perspective, but this bishop here currently is out of the game. So if you can play e5, it makes a lot of sense. One thing that Black needs to be careful of if he does play e5 is that I could potentially go d5 and create a passed pawn with an attack on the knight. Things get very concrete there because Black can play the move e4, winning my piece and just ignoring the fact that I'm taking the knight on c6. And that position seems quite decent for him. So I'm not a huge fan of that. What I could do, however, after e5 is go rook e1. That would stop the threat of e4. Although even that is a question mark. Does it actually stop the threat of e4? Because in that position, I could go bishop takes, knight takes, rook takes, queen takes, and in some positions he can take here, although his back rank is weak. And you can see immediately the position was getting extremely complicated. He's gone for b6, which is a very logical move. One thing that I would be a little bit concerned about, however, is look at his queen on a5. It's now completely, this diagonal has now been shut down. So if the kingside attack does occur, then it's very difficult for that queen to get back into the game. The way in which the king would influence the queen side would actually be by capturing on d4 and returning this way. Otherwise, it would be very, very slow to return with the queen, which gives me an idea of playing the move pawn to d5. The point is, if pawn takes, then knight takes, I can actually take this guy here. So material would be level, but my idea would be that the queen here would suddenly be very much out of play for a while, because the pawn on c5 would not be able to capture on d4. So this is one idea. Another idea that I have is just bishop g5, which creates a direct threat of capturing followed by capture. And that's a pretty annoying move, because if he goes h6, I can damage his pawn structure, and then I can play the move d5. Maybe this is a better try. And another idea is sort of a mixture of the two, which is to play d5 and after pawn takes, maybe ignore the pawn on d5, saying, I don't really care about winning a pawn on d5. I care a lot more about locking your queen out of the game. So I'm not going to waste the tempo on capturing this pawn and bring your knight into the center from where the queen might capture here. But again, this is getting very, very messy. So what I want to do is something relatively safe in this position. That's a good question as to what that is, though. Another option is knight e5. Just jumping into that central square, probably inviting the move bishop b7. And now I could even go knight g4, and in this case, try and get these two knights off the board so that I can take and keep my bishop here. But that seems a bit artificial, takes a little bit too much time. Knight g5 is another option. But again, after h6, what exactly are we doing? One option there would be to take on f7, king takes f7, bishop check, king moves, and take here. We've won a rook and a pawn for two minor pieces. The material balance is not so great for us in that particular case, but the fact that his queen would be out of play makes it a little bit more interesting. Finally, we could just play some, calm move, slow move. But I'm going to go in the end with what I think is a reasonable move, developing my final undeveloped minor piece, creating a concrete threat of capturing here and capturing on h7, which is definitely annoying for him. And yeah, and if h6, then after takes d5, he won't be able to take twice on d5, which should be in my favor. So somebody is asking about why I don't look at the chat. That's the last thing, and ironically, it means I have looked at the chat right now. I do look at the chat in between games every once in a while. I don't look at the chat during games. The reason for this is because I'm playing rated rapid games, and in the chat, a lot of people will suggest moves, and I'm happy to see that. I'm happy that people in the chat are suggesting different possibilities and talking between themselves. But if I were to actually look at that, then that would be, sometimes a person in the chat will be suggesting, maybe a winning move that I wouldn't have seen. So it would basically be cheating. So that's the main reason why I don't look at the chat. The other thing is these videos will go up on YouTube, and so try to focus on the game while I'm playing, since people on YouTube are not so much, surprisingly, they're not so interested in sort of interaction with Twitch chat, since they were, for the most part, weren't there, So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so he's gone for this option, which is interesting, running with the king, anticipating that the pawn on h7 will fall. I'm not sure why not just going to h6, but I'm a little bit annoyed in that taking the pawn takes a while, and it feels like it's going to cost me, I can win a pawn, but it's going to cost me my initiative. But nevertheless, pawn is a pawn, and that's the direction that the game is taking. I don't see anything better. So in chess, one of the mistakes that club players make sometimes, in my experience, and even quite strong players, is they'll take a look at a position and they'll say, I was attacking, I love to attack, and suddenly it's like they're offered a pawn, let's say, but they realize that if they take the pawn, they're going to lose the initiative, and they don't like that. They prefer to attack and have fun that way than to just play for material. But this is, at the higher levels, on the other hand, what you see is these guys, like at the top, in general, even though they might have preferences, in general, they're incredibly flexible in terms of how they approach it. If the position is one where you got to win a slow technical end game grind, then so be it. And if the position is one which calls for dynamic play, then so be it. You have to kind of respect what the position demands, and that's what the top guys aim to do. So we're going to try and emulate them. So after bishop takes f6, pawn takes, I played the move bishop e4 because I was a little bit afraid that if I took here, he might go f5, and then I was struggling a little bit a bit worried that I might lose this bishop. So I went bishop e4 because he couldn't take the pawn immediately because of the knight hanging on c6. That's why he played bishop to b7. And now I'll take the pawn back. So in the end, I'm up a pawn, and my position should be very, very good here. Still, I have to control my center, and his play becomes a little bit easier. This is what I mean where my initiative has been to some extent extinguished, and now I'm more hoping to play. I feel at least like I need to play more babysitting chess. You know, babysit my center and try and make something of my extra pawn down the line. But for now, my extra pawn is not very relevant because, for example, we could say that my extra pawn lies here on the pure king side. This passed pawn could make the difference down the line, but that's more likely going to make the difference in a, let's say, in an endgame, in a king and pawn endgame, something like that. So still a long way to go before this pawn exerts any influence on the game. He's gone f5, which makes a lot of sense. If I drop the bishop back, I'm a little bit worried that after rook d8, he's going to be in good shape. So I'm actually going to give up here because I just feel bishop here, rook here. I have to play awkward moves like queen b2, so I'm giving up my bishop. Normally that wouldn't be a very smart idea, but my reasoning is that my knight on e5 is going to be a very, very good piece here. No worse than his bishop. So I think that should be okay. And now the question is where to go. I could go, for example, I like the square c1 with a view to maybe targeting his king, coordinating along the dark squares. My knight can influence the dark and the light squares, but his bishop can only influence the light squares. So the idea of trying to launch some kind of attack where, you know, my knight is on a dark square and my queen is jumping onto a dark square, this makes a lot of sense to me. So the other option would be to play something like queen b2, where this diagonal might be relevant. And the nice thing of queen b2 is it would defend more material, more important pawns than if I go to c1. But I'm going to go to c1 anyway, because I think it's a little bit more adventurous of a move. I think it's quite interesting. I think objectively speaking, both are, I can't judge which one is better. And so, if you're not sure which one is better, you may as well play the move that you think is going to be more fun, right? If you feel one is better, if I felt queen b2 is much better, then I think it's a very bad habit to play a move just because you think, oh, that'll be more fun. But to play it when you're not sure, then I think it's fair game. Here, a very interesting idea is to play d5. The point is, if he takes, then I have knight c6. And if he doesn't take, then the pawn on d5 might be quite annoying because I'm still threatening knight c6. Another option is to give this check, and then the question is, where exactly is he going to go? I like this check, actually, because I'm not worried. Yeah, and when he goes there, now I'm really playing d5, because this is a move that I can play instantly when his queen, king, and rook are all targets, and the only piece defending the bishop, defending the c6 square is the bishop. So it's just a deflection tactic here, d5. And I know that I'm going to win some material because he can't move all the pieces at once. So I'm going to go check here. Worst comes to worst, after he moves the king, I'll take this rook and then I'll take here, and I'll have won an exchange. But my question is, do I have something better? Like, for example, if I go here, then I'm threatening some very nasty checks. Yeah, queen f6, queen c5 takes, king here. I'm not sure what exactly queen takes, I guess. King moves. Okay, let's do it. I think worst comes to worst, I'll be picking up a couple of pawns instead of the exchange. So that's kind of similar in terms of the evaluation, because I'm winning at least f6 and e6. And I feel like there should be something else. And there's also, of course, a lot of booby traps here. If king d6, I have queen e7 with mate. So I think he has to go here. No other square available to him that's anyway good. And now the question is, what can I do? Let's start by taking this pawn. This is what I was speaking about. And now I think this check is very nasty because he has to go to to this square, and now I have this check, and he's forced to go to a5. But somehow or another, I'm not actually, I'm not demonstrating any, I'm not demonstrating any good way. Yeah, I'm actually, suddenly I'm unfortunately having to try and flag my opponent. But yeah, the game became just a flag fest towards the end because we both had less than 10 seconds on the clock. Let's go back to this position here. And yeah, after rook h8, I went too quickly actually with knight c6. It seems that, for example, if I had gone queen g7 in this order, I think it really gives him a lot of problems because knight c6 check is a threat. And if he moves the queen, then I start taking here, and then I take here, and then I check, and then I go knight c6. And the position is just game over. He has to sacrifice so much here. Still having the threat of mate, so he has to sacrifice more or less the house. However, the way I went, knight here, still winning, and then queen f6. Yeah, what I was saying earlier was I could take here. It wouldn't be bad. It would be a very safe option to play like this, and I'm up in exchange and a pawn, so it would be quite an easy conversion. What I did was, objectively, it seems stronger according to the engine, but it gave more room to panic, to go wrong. I took here, and then I took here, and I thought, actually what happened to me is that after this check, knight b4, king a5, I actually thought, oh, there must be checkmate here. There must be immediate checkmate. And then I didn't see it. And it seems like the move that I missed was queen b7, which is a very nice idea. The threat is queen a6 here with mate. And if he takes this pawn, now I can probably just play a move like rook to c1, cracking things open, hitting his queen. And where do you go with the queen? If you go here, at a minimum, I have this. But of course, I have checkmate here. The queen, to cover the a6 square, would have to stay somewhere like e2. And now knight c6 check. If you go to b5, at a minimum, I'll pick up your queen here on e2. And if you go to a4, I guess I'll go knight d4 anyway. Queen a6 is still a threat if you leave, right? So if you go here, queen a6, queen here, and then rook c4 is checkmate. So black would try and hang on to this diagonal, but queen c6 check, king a5. Now beautiful move, rook c4, just completely KOing the queen. And if queen takes c4 here, now queen takes, now there's checkmate. And otherwise, what do you do? Something like this, you'll get checkmated this way. So there was checkmate. I did choose the best path from a computer perspective with queen f6 or queen g7, rather than taking the exchange. But here I missed, this is the benefit of being more practical. I suddenly missed queen b7 as an idea. I felt, I have no checks other than going back. And believe it or not, the queen and the bishop here, coupled with the rooks, are actually creating some potentially very menacing threats. After this check here, when I went knight e5, I was terrified that he would play the move rook a to g8. And thankfully for me, he missed it. This was just a panic move with 9 seconds on the clock, and he had 8. So it's no surprise that neither of us were playing precisely. But incredibly, the game actually would have shifted to equality when after this check, I had actually planned to play this and thought if he takes, I now have the move f3 and I'm out of the danger. But the beautiful thing is he can go king b7. And now I can check here. Do not go to b8 because I'll have this nice point of checkmate. And do not take because now I can finally break this pin. But if he went back to a6, it would have been a very frustrating draw. The point is, I cannot play f3 because my pawn is pinned. If I go knight f3 to block, it changes nothing. He can just take it. And if I go something like g4 here, actually, I'm the one that's going to lose here against his attack. I'm barely even up material. If I take here, rook h1. So, it goes to show that sometimes instead of trying to find the best moves, it's something that I said in a previous video, maybe you want to play, it's a tough balance to strike, but maybe you want to play, in fact, the the most practical choice, right? Rather than go for all of this messiness, I could have gone knight takes a5, sorry, not knight takes, queen takes rook first, then knight takes a5, and played a position like this, let's say, where my decisions would have been a lot easier. And so it would have been less likely that I would have gone heavily wrong. Okay, so that's it in terms of that game.